Hello, everyone. And everyone is a temporary term because I know that not all of you are in the room yet. I'm very happy to say hello to you and welcome everyone to Skeptical Inquirer Presents, which for my regular audience members know that this is a series of live online presentations from experts who are devoted to advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and critical thinking over magical thinking. If that's what you are expecting, you're in the right place, everyone. I'd like to tell you that in the waning days of September and these early days of fall, I hope you've had a very productive self-improvement month, and I wish you a happy National Punctuation Day. With a special shout out to those of you who are with me on Team Oxford Comma. I'm sure, and the almost 400 of you, someone has to be on my team and knows how to use punctuation properly, even when you're texting. But yes, everyone, hello. My name is Leanne Lord. I am a stand-up comedian, author, and co-host for Point of Inquiry, the podcast for the Center of Inquiry. If you want to know a little bit more about me and my work, I'd be hella tickled. And you can find out more about me that way by going to veryfunnylady.com. Not right now, but later, if you're so inclined. Now, I want to give you some fair warning here, everybody. We have a full information-packed evening, so we are going to go a little bit past the hour in order to make sure that we get in all of the presentation and some of your questions. And so if you're new here, I will point out that at the bottom of your screen, a little off to the right, is a little icon that says Q&A, and that's where you can type your questions in the form of a question. You are all very smart people, don't need the CV, just need the questions. You know how we do. Now, I am very tickled here. I had the pleasure of meeting our guest last year at SciCon. He is a professor of biology at John Jay College, and coincidentally, on this day in 1789, John Jay was nominated to be the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which I'm sure wasn't controversial at all. Our guest is the creator and host of the podcast, World of Humans, and is the author of Human Errors, What Our Quirks Tell Us About Our Past. Now, I listened to the audiobook of Human Errors, and I can attest that it is horrifyingly good stuff. Like, it made me rewrite my dating profile. On a personal note, I think you would be well served to check out the pinned post on his Twitter profile and read the thread, Why I Love What I Do. I think it is a lovely example of the bright side of social media, science, and technology. And I'm also delighted that we are both Star Trek fans, especially since today in 1968 is when the original series began shooting the poignant and sadly evergreen episode, Let This Be Your Last Battlefield. Excuse me, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. I don't want Shrekies inboxing me saying, you got it wrong. I know what it is. And so here with us this evening, sharing about how evolution only breaks things, the science denial at the heart of intelligent design, please welcome Nathan Lents. Nathan, you have the con.
Okay, thanks so much, Leanne. And it's a pleasure to see you again. I enjoyed meeting you last year at SciCon. And anyone who hasn't yet been to a SciCon, I encourage you to check it out. Next year, hoping to be back there again in Las Vegas. And I know it's going to be a great lineup again next year. Okay, so I am here to talk about evolution and the current challenge that evolutionary theory faces in winning over the public. And part of that challenge comes from this idea of what we call intelligent design. And this is basically a modern day creationist movement that has as its goal to replace evolutionary theory with a different theory of how the diversity we see in life came about. What you won't find in the ideas of intelligent design is a coherent theory of how they claim the world came about, but what it is a collection of criticisms of what they see as the shortcomings of evolution. And one of those shortcomings is that evolution only breaks things. And the book in which I became introduced to the intelligent design movement was that which I talked about last year at SciCon. So any of our people who were there last year will remember this talk. So I'm actually new to the game of defending evolution in public, but I've very much been enjoying it. And so I'm here to talk to you today about the latest movements in that. Now, a book came out last year called Darwin Devolves, and that's really what I'm here to talk about today. And this book was published by a scientist called Michael Behe. He is one of really only 2 or 3 credentialed scientists in the intelligent design movement. And the basic claim of his book, Darwin Devolves, is that random mutation, which is a big component of evolutionary theory, functions only to break things. It hurts whatever it touches. It destroys genes and diminishes protein function. And that's really the limit of what evolution can do for us. And one thing I do want to mention is that it's actually quite true that damaging a gene or a protein itself can sometimes help an organism. You can be better off sometimes by reducing the activity of a certain protein. This is neither new nor surprising, but this is what the limit of evolutionary theory can do, according to Dr. Behe. Instead, what he would say is that natural selection, as we know it, really only operates through the survival of organisms that have the occasional helpful mutation that destroys something. And he calls this his first rule of adaptive evolution. I was quite surprised that he named the rule after himself, considering this is something that we've known for a very, very long time. But he sees as the overall trend of evolution is that mutation degrades information, and then new information has to be provided from time to time. And that new information, if you're reading the book hoping to find evidence that of new information being provided to organisms from time to time, you won't find it in this book, because yet, after all these years, intelligent design proponents have yet to offer any evidence for their own idea regarding how innovation comes about. But I can't just jump in talking about this book. I have to bring everyone up to speed on what intelligent design is, how the movement started, and what's its basis. So this is a fairly young movement backed by a very old idea. The movement itself, though, really began as recently as 1989. This is the first use of the term intelligent design in a text. And that text is called Of Pandas and People. It was published in 1989. Editor Charles Thaxton, the authors of the first edition, I mention them now because they will come up in a moment. A later edition was authored by Dembski and Wells. They will also come up in a moment. But basically, this was the first biology textbook to be based on the idea of intelligent design. And the father of intelligent design, self-described, is a man called Philip Johnson, who was on the faculty of the University of California at Berkeley. He called himself the father of the intelligent design movement, but many, many others in the movement have also called him that. So I think it's safe to say that even though he said it first, we'll accept him as the father of the movement. He wrote a book called Darwin on Trial in 1991. Excuse me, that was one of his claims to fame. But I want to start, and also Philip Johnson and colleagues gathered together to form an institute where their ideas could be honed and where they could organize their operations. And that institute is called the Discovery Institute. It was founded in 1990. And it calls itself the intellectual home of the intelligent design movement. And I think that's a fair name for it, because virtually every major figure in intelligent design is either a fellow or is otherwise associated with the Institute. So for all intents and purposes, the DI is ID, meaning the Discovery Institute and intelligent design are one and the same. And they run a website called Evolution News, and this is also going to come up today. This is a website where they support their ideas and they promote their ideas, especially they promote the books of their fellows and the ideas of the fellows that Discovery Institute. So this is the website that you may have seen. It's had a couple of different names, but Evolution News has been the mainstay of that name. So we'll just call it Evolution News. I'm going to start off by making a claim that might sound quite provocative, but I'm just going to say it. Intelligent design is not science. It is Christian Evangelical creationism. Now, before anyone gets too upset, and you're saying, well, you're characterizing them in a way that they don't characterize themselves, just sit tight for a moment and I'm going to make that case for you over the next 10 minutes or so. So this movement of intelligent design really began as an attempt to put creation science back in the classrooms. And this is associated with what's known as the fourth great reawakening of the evangelical movement, predominantly in the United States, but also to a lesser extent in England. And during this fourth great reawakening, the replacement of creation science with evolution in public schools was one of their many planks of social issues. Unfortunately, the more they tried to do this, especially in the South and the Midwest of the United States, they met with court battles. So in 1982, the first major defeat of creation science happened in the state of Arkansas. That was followed quickly by a case in the state of Louisiana, which was then appealed to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court, happy to stay out of local issues, had no choice but to rule on this, and they did indeed outlaw the requirement to teach creationism in public school classrooms. However, the majority opinion written by William Brennan, perhaps he didn't see this coming, but there was one sentence, one key sentence in that majority decision that really changed the entire creationism movement in the United States. And here's that sentence. Teaching a variety of scientific theories about the origins of humankind to school children might be validly done with the clear secular intent of enhancing the effectiveness of science instruction. So it was this sentence that taught the proponents of creation science that they have to call their movement something else and divorce it from religion and pretend instead that it is secular in its intent. So making it non-religious and purely secular was the key to getting their ideas back into the classroom after this case. So the way that I often put it is that this set up a selective pressure and creation science then evolved into intelligent design. And if we're going to talk about the evolution of creation science into intelligent design, the story is best told by just looking at the textbook, the classic textbook of Pandas and People. Let's see how it evolved over time, if you'll pardon the pun. Well, the first draft of this book was completed in 1983, and it was called Creation Biology. That was the name of the textbook. The second draft, and these are unpublished drafts, the second draft of the book was Biology and Creation. Then came the Edwards decision from the Supreme Court in 1987. Suddenly, we had a new title for the book, and it was Biology and Origin in 1987. So they redrafted the book, basically to try to get around the Supreme Court decision. They had to pretend to not have a religious motive, instead have a secular motive. Well, they did this rather comically sloppily in the sense that they simply replaced the word creation and its derivatives with intelligent design. And this happened over 150 instances. For example, in the second draft from the 1985 draft, the sentence "creation means that various forms of life began abruptly" was changed to "intelligent design means that various forms of life began abruptly," just simply switching out the terms. And occasionally this introduced grammar errors in their revision process. The sentence, "evolutionists think the former is correct, creationists accept the latter view," became, in the third draft, "evolutionists think the former is correct, could design proponents accept the latter view." So you have this sort of sloppy search and replace function that tried to erase the creationist viewpoint of the book and replace it with intelligent design. The fourth draft of the book was finally published in 1989 under the title of Pandas and People. I don't know where that title came from. We don't have records on that, but this is the published first edition of the book. The second edition followed some years later, and I mention this only because Michael Behe, who we'll talk a lot about today, submitted a chapter on the irreducibly complex blood clotting cascade, as he would put it. Now, this essentially fooled no one, but they tried it anyway, and they tried to get this back into the classrooms. They tried to get creation science into United States public school classrooms by calling it intelligent design. Now, this was, of course, tested in the courts, and finally in Pennsylvania, in the Kitzmiller versus Dover area school district case, this was put to the test, and Michael Behe was an expert witness on one side, Kenneth Miller on the other, and this was played out in court over several weeks. The decision was rendered by the Republican appointee. In fact, he was appointed by George W. Bush, Judge Jones III. And in his decision, he found that we have addressed the seminal question of whether ID is science, and we have concluded that it is not. And ID cannot uncouple itself from its creationist and thus religious antecedents. So when I made the claim that intelligent design is simply Christian creationism, I'm doing that quoting an established legal fact. This was finding a fact by the court. So I can't be sued for saying, repeating a court decision. Anyway, the third edition of the book came out some years later, and they decided to change the name yet again, I presume to try to escape the bad press of Pandas and People. We have new authors, Dembski and Wells, and this was published by the Discovery Institute Press itself. So the Discovery Institute took full reins of this text, and it's still in print. The problem is Discovery Institute is not a science organization, all right? It is political Christianity. And again, let me make that case for you briefly. First of all, it was founded primarily by a man, Philip Johnson, who I've already mentioned. He's a born-again Christian. That's not the end of the story, of course. But if you allow him to speak for himself in how he framed the creation of the Discovery Institute and the intelligent design movement, you'll see that he described it in no uncertain terms as political Christianity. In fact, he has it as his explicit goal to recapture America on behalf of the Christian church. And in fact, when discussing intelligent design itself, he said, this isn't really and never has been a debate about science. It's about religion and philosophy. And on that point, I suspect we all agree. Now, the Discovery Institute is much more than just Philip Johnson. I do want to cover briefly his background. I said he was on the faculty of UC Berkeley, but that is not the science faculty. He's on the faculty of the law school. He has a JD and an undergraduate degree in English. Not exactly the kind of background that qualifies someone to take out positions in evolutionary biology. The editors and authors of the first textbook, of the first draft of Pandas and People, you will not see any degrees in biology among them. Lots of degrees, none of them in biology. And in fact, the closest is the biophysicist Dean Kenyon, who appears to hang out mostly with theologians and was an avowed young earth creationist as testified in the Arkansas case. And several other figures, you'll see lots of degrees here, very few of them in science and even fewer in biology. Really the only credentialed scientist among the founding members of Discovery Institute was a man called Jonathan Wells, who got his PhD later after he had already joined the movement and was trying to bolster credentials. I mean, Dembski has tons of degrees, none of them in biology. Jonathan Wells, I want to say, is an expert, not in biology, but in the marriage ceremony of the Unification Church. And he testifies about this marriage ceremony. This is the church founded by Reverend Sung Young Moon, and you can read about their marriage ceremonies separately. As late as 1991, Jonathan Wells, who was an author of the latest draft of Pandas and People, and Philip Johnson himself signed a letter doubting that AIDS is caused by HIV. We're not talking about 1982 or 1983. 1991, this was settled science, and they're still casting doubt on it. So as I said, intelligent design is indeed creationism. And if you look at the publisher of Pandas and People, it was the Foundation for Thought and Ethics. This was an organization that was founded by a Baptist minister and described in its own IRS filing documents as a Christian think tank with the stated purpose of teaching the Christian gospel, et cetera, et cetera. You will find nothing in its documents about biology or origins or evolution. It exists purely to promote fundamental Christianity. And in fact, when discussing the book of Pandas and People and why he wrote it, one of the two authors said, of course, my motives were religious. There's no question about it. And once again, I agree very much. One of the founding documents of the Discovery Institute, if you've never heard of it, is called the Wedge document. And I strongly urge you to look this up. We don't have time to cover it all. It's actually not that long. You can read it in 10 minutes. And you'll find a document filled with their wishes to overturn modern society and replace it with a Christian worldview. And in fact, Dembski, Berlinski, and Behe himself tutored Ann Coulter on intelligent design for her book, Godless, the Church of Liberalism. So hopefully I have done a lot of work here to convince you that these are creationists, Christian creationists, not scientists behind the intelligent design movement. But if you just look at their own materials, and this all comes from their own materials, I'm not smearing anyone. If you look at the Evolution News website, if you look through the articles, you'll find articles about evolution and science. They're always critical, but it's not even really just about that. You know, you'll find articles on abortion, euthanasia, gay marriage. Marxism and communism are favorite boogeymans of Evolution News. I don't know that that's ever really come up so much in evolutionary theory, but these issues are apparently important to the Discovery Institute. Just some of the articles in the last few years that you'll find. These are headlines from their articles about abortion, transgender issues, gay marriage. And in fact, an article a few years ago really said it best is, here's what happens when you eliminate science's spiritual foundations. And those are the foundations that they would like to see science return to, rather than the foundations we know of as, which is reason, rationality, evidence, data, and of course, thoughtful interpretations. So how did I become interested in the Discovery Institute? Well, my first book, 2016, they completely ignored, and I was happy. I'd never heard of them. But I published it in 2016, Columbia University Press, not so different. It's about human and animal behavior. It's a comparative behavior book. And it is about human evolution. It didn't attract much attention from the creationist community, except for, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have the cover up there. That's the cover of the book. Oh, we can plug that. But actually, it did catch the attention of Ken Ham over at Answers in Genesis. You may have heard of Ken Ham. Now, Ken Ham, he has the Creation Museum and the Ark Experience and so forth. So he wrote a blog post about my book. It actually wasn't even about the book. He didn't pretend to read the book. He was responding to a press release about the book. Anyway, he took issue with the whole notion of humans and animals being different. And one thing I will say about Ken Ham, he's not particularly science literate. However, he doesn't pretend to be. He doesn't pretend to be anything other than a fundamental Christian creationist. And so on that one score, I find him more respectable than the Discovery Institute, simply because he's transparent about who he is and what his motives are. He published this blog post about my book, and I decided, well, why not thoughtfully dialogue? And I wrote a little blog post of my own, took a few days, and tried to rebut a few of the points. And I host the Human Evolution blog, and so I decided to just rebut his points and put it out there. And I didn't hear anything back. I didn't really expect to, but I put it out there. So by the time my second book comes around, which is called Human Errors, as we've talked about before, this one has intelligent design written all over it, but not by me. I actually did not write it as a rebuttal to intelligent design. I agree that the content of the book is a challenge for those who support intelligent design, but that's not how I wrote the book. I didn't intend to start any kind of fight. But I wrote the book, and it did catch the attention of their community first, though it was actually an article that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal. I was invited to write about my book for the journal, and I did so. I didn't choose the title, but it's called The Botch of the Human Body. And not too long after that, an article appeared on Evolution News website. I didn't know that this wasn't the first article about me, but it was the first one that I noticed. And it was called Botched Body, Bad Design, or Bad Logic, by a person who I never heard of before and haven't heard from since, Steve Loftman, who takes issue not with the book, but with what he imagines the book contains. Because actually most of the points that he raised is actually what the book is about. So it's clear he hadn't read the book. But I, once again, thought I'd take a few days and write a thoughtful rebuttal to his points. And that's what I did. I put it up on my website. And I sort of expected that to be the end of it. Well, I underestimated the Discovery Institute when I did that, because they are not like Ken Ham, as I mentioned. Instead, their approach is to flurry you with responses. Partially, this is a strategy to overwhelm the Google search returns to make sure that, that they swarm those results. But they just started basically writing articles about me, about the book, and almost a never-ending deluge. Every morning I would wake up to more and more articles that were written about me. And most of them, again, weren't even about the claims of the book. They were about articles that were being written about the book in the popular press. There were articles in the New York Post, et cetera, the Times, Discovery Magazine. Lots of people were covering the book. And so they were reacting to that coverage quite negatively and quite harshly, and not the models of Christian charity that we hope they would be. At one point, I was quite pleased to notice that I had all three of the featured article positions on Evolution News. I thought this was kind of cool. All three of the slots were articles about me. And I will say, if nothing else came from this, I am quite happy that there's an article now out there titled Nathan Lents and the Wisdom of Testicles. I tell everyone I know that such an article exists. Anyway, so that's how I got into the Discovery Institute crosshairs, and why I decided to eventually fight back when they would put their material out there. So now we're back to where we started, Michael Behe. So Michael Behe is, as I said, one of the few truly credentialed biologists in their movement. Michael Denton, Michael Behe, I struggle to name another, but when I say credentialed, I mean has a degree in a relevant discipline, has published, done research over years and decades. He does have that. So I don't think much of what intelligent design is really worthy of a response from the scientific community. However, Michael Behe writes with the veneer of scientific authority, and I think that we do well to counter that, because he writes very well, he's a good writer, and he has decent command of the scientific particulars. And so when someone with his credentials writes, I do think we have an obligation to respond, and that's why I was happy to do that. Michael has a Ph.D. in biochemistry, and he's a tenured professor at Lehigh University. And his claim to fame originally was the book Darwin's Black Box, which he published in 1996 about the concept he called irreducible complexity. This is the idea that molecular machines, as he calls them, are so complex and interconnected, have so many parts that they couldn't possibly have evolved piecewise, because if all the pieces aren't in place, it can't function. Okay, so that was Darwin's black box. This is not a scientific idea, but it did put him on the map, and it forced some evolutionary theorists to do some work on some areas that had been underdeveloped. So in a sense, it was a contribution. I will say his own department felt the need to distance themselves from his work. So, and this is still there. If you go to the Lehigh University website, Department of Biological Sciences, you will find a statement where they distance themselves from his book, from himself, and say that intelligent design has no basis in science and should not be regarded as scientific. Anyway, his next book came some years later. It's called The Edge of Evolution, where he tries to distinguish between microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution being that which he thinks natural selection can accomplish. And then he tries to attempt to put mathematical probabilities on the bigger evolutionary transitions, the macroevolution that leads to new kinds of organisms. He's not a mathematician, and it clearly shows in this book, and this book attracted very little attention. But last year he published a book that attempts to get back on top called Darwin Devolves. And this is where he takes his ideas about microevolution and runs further with them, claiming basically that it works almost entirely through the selection of destructive but advantageous mutations. As I said, he claims Darwinian evolution breaks things or destroys information, whereas intelligent design creates things or adds information. Once again, this latter claim he offers absolutely no evidence for. And just as an aside, I'm a genome scientist myself. I study the evolution of the human genome. I assure you that if intelligent design did anything like this, it would leave an abundance of evidence to be found. So far, nothing yet. The idea of irreducible complexity comes up again in this book, and he repeats claims that have been debunked. So I want to just sort of mention it a little bit again. So this is the notion that you have these complex systems with all these parts. And he couldn't see a conceivable path that the parts could ever be one at a time added by natural selection. And he even claims that biochemical structures appear in one fell swoop. That is his quote. The problem is nobody thinks that's how it works. Complex parts don't all of a sudden appear all at once. They evolve from simplicity. So complexity evolves from simplicity gradually, and an entire complex structure evolves as a unit with tweaks along the way. Fully formed components don't just get added, right, one at a time. And moreover, structures and systems evolve and take on new functions. And so something can be evolved for one function and then co-opted from the other. For example, and even the functions of the systems themselves will evolve over time. So basically, the scientific community had no idea what he was talking about when he raised these criticisms, because these were problems that, for the most part, had been solved decades ago. But he did offer examples that hadn't been worked out, and they've all been debunked, and it doesn't stop him from repeating them. For example, the blood clotting cascade. Kenneth Miller provided a very elegant stepwise process of how that would evolve. And there's been obvious gene duplication among the proteases involved in the blood clotting cascade. And in fact, just as we would predict, a precursor to the main clotting factor has actually been found in sea cucumbers, which is a non-vertebrate. An echinoderm, and it has nothing to do with clotting. This is a system that has been co-opted for a new function. All the evidence is there. He has similar examples. Oh, and I wanted to say that these have been rebutted for many, many years. The answers to his supposed questions are out there, and he pretends that they're not. He has other examples, such as the bacterial flagellum. Well, we know that this evolved from type 3 secretion machinery, so on and so forth. There's other examples, and the rebuttals are out there, but yet he repeats them in his book, Darwin Devolves, as if the scientific community has no response. So now let's get into this book itself. And one thing I will say is that you might have wondered, well, what scientific outlet would publish this, or what academic press? Well, the answer is no academic press would publish this. And this is evidence, as you can see by the subtitle, The New Science About DNA That Challenges Evolution. I mean, scientists don't talk like that. It's a weird subtitle. But the main title, Darwin Devolves, I'm going to save that for last. That's going to be the last slide where we talk about the silliness of this title. But who is the publisher of this book? Well, it's an imprint of Harper Publishers called Harper One. And Harper One is the imprint that is committed to publishing important books across its historical core categories of religion, spirituality, health, personal growth, social change, relationships, and creativity. This is not a science publisher, and this book is not peer-reviewed. Okay, so the main thesis of this book is that random mutation only breaks things, or usually only breaks things. And that, admittedly, a damaged gene or protein can sometimes help an organism. This is very true, and we have lots of examples of this, and he even puts forward some examples of this, which we have no challenge with. And then he would say that that's really the limit of natural selection. And he sees this as an overall trend. I already covered this slide, but whereas evolution degrades things and the intelligent designer must interact. And he puts a fine point on this, and he claims that Darwinian evolution can diversify organisms into species and genera and families, perhaps, but no further than that, because further than that, higher level taxa represent a major biochemical innovation or a major anatomical innovation. And his claim is that unguided evolution could never produce those kind of changes. So he sees two options for the designer in this context. One is that all the information that will be subsequently needed is preloaded in the organisms. This is sometimes called the perfect pool shot, where everything is in place for the whole thing to play out and all the balls to end up in the pockets or what have you. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that there is a regular influx of new genetic information into the organisms as they evolve into new kinds of things. Once again, I will say this as a genome scientist who spends his days looking at DNA sequences. If either of those options were true, they would have left a lot of evidence very easy to be found. And so far, they haven't even offered evidence of the actions of a designer. Their evidence for the designer is simply the inability of evolutionary theorists to describe every single step with molecular precision in organisms that are extinct for millions of years. So we're being held to an impossible standard where their own idea really has no standard. So when this book was announced, I expressed a desire to review it, and Science Magazine invited me to do so. So I put together a team, myself and Josh Swamidas and Richard Lenski, and we tackled this book, the book review. And we decided to work on it cooperatively over several weeks. We ended up with an enormous amount of criticisms and way too many points. And Science Magazine came back to us and said, this is the front matter of the journal. This is not the back matter, the scholarly part. This is the book review section. You have 750 words. So we had to leave most of our criticisms on the cutting room floor. And I realized maybe I learned a lesson from the Discovery Institute. I had all this material that it couldn't fit in, so I would spin it off into reviews. So I sort of tried to take the fire to them and fight fire with fire. So in addition to my review in Skeptic Magazine, or in Science Magazine, I wrote an article for Skeptic Magazine, and they gave it the cover. I was very, very happy about that. And then another website for the remaining material. This is called The Inventors in Poor Taste. I'm a big fan of all three of these outlets, and I've published in there multiple times. And I have friends at both locations. So here I was thinking, I got some stuff out of there. Well, I want to talk about what's wrong with the book. First of all, as I've already said, he repeats claims about irreducible complexity that have already been debunked. And he claims that they're unchallenged. I simply can't understand how he claims that they're unchallenged when the way I read the literature, they've not only been challenged, but debunked. He also completely misreads the long-term E. coli evolution experiment. So this is an experiment by Richard Lenski in his lab that's been going on for more than 30 years, I think about 70,000 generations of E. coli growth, where they study the evolution of this organism over time. Michael Behe is quite upset that they haven't evolved into new kinds of bacteria. But remember that the laboratory environment of fixed conditions and no predators, no competitors, no immune system is a recipe for streamlining, not for innovation. Basically, it's a race to see who can become the most efficient E. coli that they can. I won't spend too much time on debunking this particular claim because Richard Lenski has done that. So if you go to his blog, you can read several articles in responding to the book, Darwin Devolves, basically doing the same thing I did, material that didn't make it into our science review, he put onto his blog. Very long, thoughtful, detailed answers. Because since Behe devoted almost a full chapter to this experiment, Lenski felt like he had to respond to it. Another thing that Darwin Devolves misses is that about Darwin's finches, and these are on the cover of the book. So Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands have evolved into several different species based from an ancestral population that was on the mainland. Well, Behe's quite confused why they didn't evolve into all kinds of different things, like hawks and eagles and different kinds of birds altogether. He compares it to the Cambrian explosion, failing to recognize that the Cambrian explosion, first of all, happened over a much longer period of time, but also happened so long ago when animals were first appearing on the globe, and all of the niches that they would come to dominate were completely unoccupied. The reason why Darwin's finches didn't evolve into an eagle is there were already eagles on the Galapagos Islands. There were already hawks. There were already every other kind of bird you could imagine, pretty much. So all they could do was specialize in their way of being. What's interesting to me, and I made a big deal about this in Skeptic Magazine, is that Behe almost catches his own mistake because he brings up the lemurs of Madagascar, and he's somewhat impressed that they have reached the level of family and their diversification among species and genera. And he almost gets it because when the ancestors of modern day lemurs arrived in Madagascar, there were no mice, so we have the mouse lemur. There was no sloth, so we have the sloth lemur. And you can just extend this throughout. There's ones that look almost like a gorilla because there were no other primates. So those niches were unoccupied. And sure enough, the lemurs of Madagascar evolved into all of those niches. And we see incredible adaptive radiation. And he almost gets it. But he claims that the designer must have provided the new genetic information. He does not provide any evidence for that claim. He also just simply ignores the ways that complexity innovation are actually generated. So he claims that evolutionary theory can't explain innovation, but he doesn't bother to argue with the ways that we say that it mentions innovation, that it develops innovation. For example, the word exaptation, where a structure is co-opted from one function to another, that word doesn't even appear in the text, not even one time. He doesn't mention horizontal gene transfer, and that's a transfer of genetic material from one organism to another, one species to another. And they can be distantly related even, and we know that's happened. That's not mentioned even once either. The word recombination appears precisely once, and genetic recombination, as we know, is an engine of diversity. And gene duplication and divergence is dismissed as insufficient, ignoring all of the wealth of research that shows that gene duplication allows an incredible amount of creativity and innovation. When you have a gene that performs one function, and then it gets duplicated into two copies, the copies, one or the other, is then free to take on new functions because it's not constrained by the original function. This is a key way that evolution works. This is barely discussed at all, and it is discussed only enough so that he can dismiss it. And in fact, I would consider a very glaring omission, zero discussion of an article in 2012 where they actually demonstrated real-time evolution of new genes through a process they called innovation, amplification, and divergence. And this was in the synthesis of amino acids. And you can see from an ancestral gene that has slight bifunctional characteristics, copies itself into multiple copies, and those copies diversify. And these are all potential evolutionary paths that these organisms followed in order to go from one bifunctional gene to two diversified genes. And this is in 3,000 generations. So in evolutionary terms, this is the blink of an eye, and we see a beautiful demonstration of how gene duplication can really lead genes into whole new functions. So I published my criticisms into several reviews, and I should have known what was going to come. If you poke the squid, you get the ink. And we do refer to this as squid's ink. That's kind of the pattern of the Discovery Institute. My friend Art Hunt, that's where I got the term for this. They just squirt as much material as they can, different articles on different points, never really addressing the criticisms, but swarming you with material to read. They started with the articles, and more articles get published about why my reviews were so bad, and why Lenski didn't understand his own work, and why we were just a bad team to review this work. And his weirdest claim is that we didn't address his main argument, when in fact all of our material was completely addressed to debunking his main argument. But one thing I will mention is that our book review was in the front half of Science Magazine, meaning it was kind of for a popular crowd. But there's been one that I'm aware of, a scholarly review, which is open-ended. There's no word limit. You can be as technical as you want. So in the scientific literature, there's been one article that directly takes on Darwin Devolves with at length, with lots of citations and technical jargon, just explaining how much it misses the mark. And the honor of writing, and this is in Evolution, which is the top journal in the field of evolutionary biology. And they did review his work. As I mentioned, he is a scientist, so he's perhaps the one member that we have to take seriously of the Discovery Institute. And the honor went to Gregory Lang and Amber Rice. You might not know who they are, but you have heard of where they're from. They are his colleagues at Lehigh University in the Department of Biological Sciences. And they wrote an incredibly erudite review filled with lots of important citations of work that you can look up yourself, explaining just how evolutionary theory indeed does explain adaptive innovation and complexity with great molecular detail. And I will also say, I'm not going to read any of these. You can, if you're watching this on video, you can pause these. They pull no punches in their review. We really tried to keep our gloves up with our official reviews, but they wrote a very good, direct, and scholarly review. And if you have the ability to access this and understand this article, it does a far better job than the rest of us put together. But you knew it was coming. Michael Behe wouldn't take that laying down, so he wrote articles about them as well on Evolution News. You can read these if you want. There's the titles there, but I'll summarize them for you pretty well. He basically just says "nuh-uh" to their many claims. So just to summarize why this is wrong. First of all, his main claim is just obvious and totally unsurprising. It's known for a long time that degradative mutations can sometimes help an organism. And I'm going to give you an example of one of those in a minute. But it's also way overstated. He makes a huge deal out of the examples that support his view, and he even exaggerates them, as we'll see. But he dismisses all of the examples that don't support his view. And in fact, we know from measuring the genetic diversity in species, they represent a very small fraction of the genetic diversity that we see in all species. So if he were right, we would expect that to be a much larger fraction. He also conflates, and Richard Lenski does a great job explaining this, the difference between what happens commonly and what is important for evolution. So yes, damaging mutations are much easier to come up with in an unguided process. Most mutations would be harmful or neutral at best, but they don't last and they're weeded out of the population. They're not fundamental mutations that change in a lasting way the destiny of an organism. So something that happens commonly in the lab versus something that's actually important for the history of a species. He conflates those two, and that's a big misunderstanding regarding evolutionary theory. He also assumes, without saying it, but he assumes that natural selection is the only force in evolution. He calls both of them Darwinism. He uses the word sloppily to refer to either one, but actually natural selection is not the only force of evolution. We know that there are many other forces. We've actually learned quite a bit since 1859, if you can believe it, from the publication of On the Origin of Species. Darwin didn't know about genetic drift or neutral theory or recombination, exaptation, sexual selection, punctuated, and the list goes on and on. And so when Michael Behe claims that natural selection is insufficient to explain the diversity of life, yeah, we know. There's lots more going on than just natural selection, and you should try reading about it. He also completely ignores mechanisms that generate novelty, and that we have examples of this. One example he used as something that couldn't evolve on its own is a gated ion channel. So an ion channel allows ions through the cell membrane, in or out of a cell, and it's gated. He said that could never evolve on its own. Well, there's an example of TRF13, which really just popped together from a non-coding DNA in the mitochondria, and this has been written about. And he just, where's the image there? Did it come up? I missed it. Anyway, a great article was written about it in Pandas Thumb, there it is, on how this could have evolved by my friend, Art Hunt. And again, Behe pretends that this just hasn't been answered, that we haven't answered this. There's a kind of bacteria that has evolved to digest a wood preservative that wasn't even invented till the 1920s. But yet they've evolved the ability to digest it by co-opting two pathways that have nothing to do with each other to cooperate. And I talk about that in one of my reviews. So he just simply ignores the examples that are out there. He also totally misunderstands niche occupation by claiming, why don't the bacteria evolve into something else? Why didn't Darwin's finches become hawks? He just doesn't simply understand that what's already there constrains the potential that any organism has. And he also seems to forget that genes and proteins have multiple functions and multiple binding partners that can easily be co-opted from one function to another. He insists that all the mutations, duplications that are necessary have to happen all at once. And he says, how likely that all this would happen all at once? Nobody claims it happens all at once. It's a stepwise process. Each one of them improbable, but when you put them together over evolutionary time and add selection, it becomes not just probable, but reality. And it's how we understand that it's happened. So he exploits our ignorance of things that we can't possibly know. So the precise order of molecular events that took place millions of years ago. Molecules don't leave fossils for the most part. So we can't always know every single step. But yet his own hypothesis is even more unknowable, has no evidence behind it. He just simply fills it in as this sort of default position. So this position, of course, requires no evidence. So I want to return back to all of the articles that were written about our review, attempting to rebut them. One of them jumped out at me when he discussed his opening example, polar bears. And he was complaining, why didn't we take some time and discuss his example of polar bears? So, and this came out 2 weeks after our review did. So we were done, we thought, reviewing the book. So I went back to this text in the book. And let's talk about this in some detail, because I think it shows basically the pattern of behavior when it comes to the Discovery Institute and how they operate when they receive criticism. So first of all, the polar bear's genome has been sequenced. It sequenced many individuals, and they've also sequenced the genomes of brown bears, and to establish the genetic events that led to the creation of polar bears. It's been very recent, very rapid. Basically, a population of ancestral brown bears migrated north, became polar bears, and the ancestral population is pretty much the same it was as the brown bears of today. Michael Behe, since this did happen recently and rapidly, there has been a fair number of harmful mutations, harmful to the proteins that led to these. And Behe uses the example of pigment loading into the hair. So if you take a pigment gene and damage it, so that pigment is no longer loaded into the hair. That's how you can get white hair from an otherwise brown-haired individual. So that's a fairly non-controversial example. And indeed, that exactly has happened in the polar bear. And this is why I skimmed right through this section of the book. It all sort of sounded right, and I didn't take my time. And there's a lesson there. Don't give them an inch. Don't give them a single example, because when you look deeply, sometimes they're even making it up on the easy stuff. So first of all, what I found, so I went and found the paper. You guys can read this paper yourself. I don't know if it's open access, but if you have institutional access, you can get it. So I read the paper more carefully in detail, and I found that, first of all, he grossly exaggerated even the data that is in the paper. He said 65 to 83% of the positively selected genes, so these are the genes that have evolved in the polar bear, are estimated to have at least suffered at least one damaging mutation. So first of all, his basic math is wrong. There's no way you get to these numbers without ignoring some data. It could be as low as 41%. Not a big deal, fine, whatever. But he also cherry picks which algorithms the authors use to make his case, and he ignores any results that don't support his position. Furthermore, he counts a single probably damaging mutation anywhere in the protein, and he counts that as a damaged protein, even if there are many other mutations in the protein that might very well enhance the protein. Proteins are big, and the polar bear versus brown bear version of that protein might have 20 differences in it, or 10, or even 5. One that is predicted to damage doesn't mean that the whole thing is damaged. So he basically cherry picks the math in all of his examples in order to support his main argument. And he makes a big deal out of one gene. So let's look at it. Behe calls it the most strongly selected variant gene, ApoB. And ApoB, he calls it the most strongly selected. And by the way, it's not most, it's second most. I called him on that too. That was the one error he did admit, that it was number 2 on the list and not number 1. Anyway, he calls it the most strongly selected gene, ApoB. And what ApoB stands for apolipoprotein B. And what this protein does is it clears cholesterol out of your blood following a high-fat meal. So if you eat a bunch of cholesterol, this protein is busy pulling that cholesterol out of your blood and storing it, because cholesterol hanging out in the bloodstream is not good. Now, polar bears, their diet is much, much higher in cholesterol, right? They basically eat seal fat as their primary food source, but yet they don't suffer heart disease. So they have a much higher fatty diet compared to brown bears, but yet they don't get heart disease. And this gene has been heavily mutated. Behe's claim is it must be damaged. Catch the logic there? So this is the gene that would protect them from heart disease. It's mutated, and he assumes it must be harmful mutations. And in fact, when you look, and as I did, at where the mutations are in the length of the protein, they all cluster in the N-terminal region, which is the most critical part of the protein for its function of cholesterol clearing. So if these were random mutations that damaged it, they'd be spread equally through the protein. But these are positively selected mutations, meaning that these mutations helped the polar bear. Now, if you're helping the polar bear against heart disease and you're in the cholesterol clearance, you would think that's enhanced protein. And no, and we know that if you suffer mutations, random mutations in the human population, you're more prone to heart disease. So we know that that's its function. Anyway, Behe claims that the authors claim that the mutations were very likely to be damaging. He's quoting the authors here, according to him. The mutations were very likely to be damaging, that is, degrade the function of this protein. And that's his quote. But if you look and read the paper, as I did, what they actually said was adaptive changes in ApoB, which enabled the species to cope with a high fatty acid intake by contributing to effective clearance of cholesterol from the blood. There's no way you could read that statement as saying that they think these mutations are damaging. In fact, they're saying that this protein has enhanced function. So I wrote this up, and it was Art Hunt, again, my friend. He and I interact a lot on the Peaceful Science Forum, discussing science, and there's actually a live discussion going on right now over at Peaceful Science. So we put this article together, Art Hunt and I, and we said that even his opening example in polar bears, he's actually completely misread the data on ApoB. Well, Michael Behe was not happy with this, so he sent out another angry rant. Oddly, he directed it at Jerry Coyne. Many of you will know him, one of the most famous evolutionary biologists in the United States. Well, Jerry Coyne had read our article and blogged about it on his blog, Why Evolution is True. And so Michael Behe lashes out. He refuses to name, he and another guy, that's me and Art Hunt he's talking about. He said we shouldn't rely on them because they don't know what they're talking about, Jerry. But he didn't actually defend his claims, except in the last 2 sentences of that angry rant. He says this: below is the relevant information from Liu et al. Table S7. Those who can understand the table will see that it supports every actual undistorted claim I made about the polar bear. Those are the only two sentences where he defends his position that ApoB has been damaged. And then he says, here's table S7. Well, when I read this article, I didn't recognize this chart. And remember, I had read the original article, and he had to have known that I did. And this is not what table S7 looks like. He presented a chart as if it was table S7, although he says the relevant information from. Let's come back to that. Now remember that his claim, and this is again what he posted, his claim is that all the mutations in the polar bears from brown bears are damaging to the protein. So this is the chart. Here's the thing. Here's the real chart. This is the actual table S7, and you'll immediately see that it's much, much, much bigger. So he has extracted information out of the original chart to make his version of this chart. Because of the size, there's no way you're gonna be able to see everything. So I'm gonna take just the top half of this chart now and blow it up. You could do this with the bottom half of the chart, and I did it to make sure, but we're gonna look at just the top half of the chart. These are the genes that the polar bears have different versions of. These are the precise positions in the genes that have been mutated. And here's the brown bear version, or actually the ancestral version. And here's the polar bear version. And here is an algorithm that predicts whether or not that mutation is damaging. And here's a different algorithm that does the same prediction. So there's, this is predictive biology. You have different algorithms, different programs. So two possible programs that predict whether it's damaged or not. Notice there's no output for enhanced functions. These algorithms are not that sophisticated. They just know whether it would disrupt the structure or not. If it doesn't disrupt the structure, it's called benign, and it very well could be enhancing, maybe, maybe not, you don't know. But a damaging mutation is somewhat detected because it twists the protein a little bit. And in fact, those could actually be enhancing too, but you don't know until you do the work. This is not what Behe presented though. I'm gonna circle the parts that he decided to chop out of this chart to present his version of it. First of all, he decided not to talk about this algorithm at all, and only talk about this algorithm. You'll notice that this algorithm and this algorithm give slightly different predictions, in that this algorithm says things are damaged more often than this one does. But this one, it looks only about half of the mutations are damaging, possibly less. But this one gives more of the view that he likes, which is that these mutations are damaging. But you'll notice his chart was not just missing columns, it was also missing rows. So which rows did he delete? Well, here's the first set of rows that he deleted. You'll notice from his chart, in these two benign mutations were deleted, and these three. Now, I'm trying to be charitable here. Well, it looks like he's removing all the information that argues against his position, but maybe he just didn't want to talk about the protein AIM1. Well, actually, two of the mutations in AIM1 he cut out, but he left one of them in. And three of the mutations of ARID5B he chopped out, but he left one of them in. And that's pretty much the pattern. Everything in this chart that does not support his position, he dissected out of it with surgical scalpel precision in order to present the view that the overwhelming preponderance of these mutations were damaging to the protein. I decided not to write a new article and just updated my other one, but word got around, and oh man, did the Discovery Institute get unhappy with me for pointing out the rather sticky egg on Michael Behe's face. And they put out a whole bunch of articles, all to do with our review of polar bears and why it was wrong. And one of them even takes the chart itself and tries to spin this as he's just showing what's relevant to his argument. Of course he is, and he's omitting everything that shows his argument isn't right. And in fact, one of the articles that they published had the title that I thought was apropos, "Remind me again why we picked polar bears." I'm sure lots of people were wondering at that point. So privately, a lot of other fellows and folks at the Discovery Institute were a little bit annoyed that Behe would do this, because it really did show that he hadn't done his homework on even his opening example. This was the prime example that he offered, one that I thought sounded solid enough that I didn't scrutinize it very well at first. I wish I had. But so goes this opening example, so goes the rest of the book, in the sense that it's cherry-picked data to try to support a position that he already held, that he already wanted to hold. And that's why the proper way that science is done is to go where the data leads, rather than slicing apart the data and selecting that which upholds your position. So as promised, I want to return to the title of the book. The title of the book is Darwin Devolves. He uses the word devolve to mean diminish or harm. He uses devolution, which neither of those words had I ever heard before. These are not scientific terms. No scientists use these words, at least not this way. Devolution is that which gets less functional and less sophisticated. This is a profound misunderstanding of what evolution is. He offers devolution as the opposite of evolution, as if evolution leads to greater complexity, enhanced function of genes and proteins. That's evolution. And if it's reduced function, it's devolution. Not at all the case. Evolution is simply change over time due to differences in reproductive rates. That's it. That change can be streamlining, it can be simplification. It does not have to be complexity. Lots of things evolve their way into a very simple form. Lots of genes get damaged. And in fact, one example I give in human errors is we have 15,000 pseudogenes in our own genome. So we have almost as many broken genes as functional genes in our own genome, because evolution, it's not a steady march towards perfection. It's not a steady increase in sophistication. It's not in any way headed towards a target. Evolution is sloppy, it's aimless, it often makes mistakes, and it damages proteins along the way, and that's the normal process of evolution. So that he would use a title that is so misunderstanding of what basic evolutionary theory is and holds, to me, that's the whole story. You really don't need to read past the title of the book to understand that the person criticizing evolutionary theory really hasn't taken the time to understand it. So that's all I have for you today. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate the invitation. As I mentioned, over at Peaceful Science, we are discussing this. I'm going to jump on the discussion board to take questions, but I think we're going to actually, I was good. I stayed to time, and I think we can actually get some questions in today.
Yes, for sure. Nathan, thank you so very, very much. Everybody, I want to remind you that if you tuned in late or you didn't buckle up strongly enough, that we are recording this. So if you have missed some of this, or you want to go back and ruminate or make sure that you're understanding, this talk is recorded and will be available on skepticalinquirer.org, the website, tomorrow. And we do indeed have questions, although, Nathan, I have to say, I'm going to go out on a limb on this and say that you are not on Behe's Christmas card list, are you?
I don't expect so. No, he's never addressed me personally, but he's been dismissive of me in articles he's written.
Yeah, I don't know who has this time to write so many articles. But I do think that if I understood this correctly, I think the panda bears have a case for liable for sure. And polar bears don't get heart disease. This makes them eminently dateable.
Right.
Because I'm in the category where dudes get heart disease. I'd look at a polar bear. I'd do that.
Yeah, at least they're ApoB.
Exactly. Well, we do have some questions here. Joshua Swamadas? I am so horrible at pronouncing names, everybody. Please believe I'm doing my best. I don't mean to insult anyone. Had our very first question here. And the question is, wasn't intelligent design used before then when you spoke in the beginning? And they say, by example, by Boyle or Paley.
That's right. So the idea about an intelligent designer goes way back. It goes, all the way back to the ancients. And in fact, through the medieval times, Aquinas talked about his fifth proof of God was basically an intelligent designer. And Richard Paley really laid out a proof of God based on the actions of an intelligent designer. And he first offered the famous watchmaker analogy that Richard Dawkins then wrote about. I had several slides on this, but I had to cut them for time. And Darwin actually read Richard Paley and was convinced by it, because remember, Darwin hadn't come up with natural selection yet. And so the watchmaker analogy, which is you stumble upon a watch out in the forest, do you presume that it came together by natural processes or that somebody designed it? That's the analogy. And it was very convincing until you can conceive of evolution by natural selection, which in the West we hadn't yet before Darwin. It was very convincing. And so Darwin himself read and approved of Paley. But actually the resistance goes even before that, though. So if you look at Hume, Hume argued very strenuously against what would become the watchmaker analogy. They didn't have a term for it yet. So there was resistance to the idea of an intelligent actor even before that. But yes, he's quite right that the movement started in 1989, it was really in 1990. But the idea goes way back. It's absolutely correct.
Cool, very cool. I love how smart our audience is. And the watchmaker analogy, I think, needs a little bit of updating. Because if you stumble upon an Apple Watch, you're not asking these questions. You're just putting it on and making sure it works for you. Maybe you buy a new band. Irv Smith asks, how do we respond? Oh, I love these. I love that we always try to engage people that don't agree with us. How do we respond when somebody, not a young earther, acknowledges that evolution as a process evidently has occurred, but the process itself was divinely inspired, i.e. intelligent design? How do we do that?
Right. So, I mean, ultimately, what we can do is we can model evolutionary theory in the lab. And what we've seen is that unguided processes actually don't need any help. And as far as we can model things that take thousands of iterations to happen, we've seen no large barrier to these things happening without guidance. For example, if you can put RNA molecules in a test tube, and if you wait long enough, and I don't mean millennia, I mean weeks or months, they will self-assemble into self-replicating molecules. So, the major barriers and transitions, we're still working on how life first got started, but anytime we've really tried to tackle important steps, you will see that it happens in the lab even faster than we thought it could. So we don't have any steps that seem to have required intervention in order to have happened. That's one way you can counter that. The second thing you could say is that ultimately, when it comes down to, and in fact, I've actually seen Jerry Coyne and Michael Behe fight this out in articles. And Michael Behe said to Jerry Coyne, he said, well, you're confusing that it happened with how it happened. So when you get to that level of disagreement saying, okay, so these are the mutations that happened, you say they were guided and I say they weren't, then at that point, there's nothing you could do. So you could just agree to disagree because the molecules moving, do we know that there is any supernatural force moving the molecules? Of course we don't. There's no way you could prove that one way or the other. And if people want to constrain the acts of an intelligent actor into that little space, let them. That's generally what I say. As long as you're not trying to go into classrooms and tell us that evolutionary theory can't explain it, then I have no trouble with anyone's private beliefs on that.
We have a couple of folks asking a similarly themed question, which is, what are Behe's motivations for continuing to ignore actual information?
Well,
what's going on here?
Well, as a book author myself, and you are too, Leanne, selling books makes good money. So, and I don't mean to say that he's inherently dishonest about it. What I mean to say is when you have strong financial incentives towards believing something, you're going to continue believing it. So that's one thing. But also, he's very upset when we say that he doesn't respond to his criticisms. And in fact, I heard a rumor, and somebody told me that they heard it too. So I think it's true that he's writing a book right now, not writing, but a book is being published that's a collection of his essays responding to critics. I heard that this book is coming out this fall, because he's so upset that people say he doesn't respond. But what he misses is he replies, but I wouldn't say that he responds. He just simply repeats his claim. So when he puts numbers on some of his simulations and other people say, no, that's not, you're not modeling it right because you're demanding that these events happen at the same time when they could have happened separately. He then responds by just giving the math again for the separate events happening at the same time. We're like, no, but we said that's wrong. So he just simply repeats his claim and he calls that a response. So there's a reply and there's a response. And I would say he hasn't responded to the criticisms, but he has replied on occasion.
Okay. It's kind of feeling like how your mom might speak to you sometimes because I said so. And I'm like, that's not a reason. Right. And then I lose the fight.
And anyway. if you have the ability to read the article in Evolution magazine and then his responses to it, to me, it puts it in very clear relief because they document all of the ways that evolution has been shown to generate innovation in an unguided way. And he, again, simply comes back to, well, you don't know that it was unguided. Well, yeah, okay, I don't know what to say to that.
Right. I guess this is based on something you said earlier, making sure we were clarifying our terms. And this is not a question, but I liked it anyway. Matt Young said he's always careful to call it intelligent design creationism.
Right. And I actually refused to do that at first because I did think they deserved credit for accepting a lot of the, because I think of creationism as young earth creationism. And so intelligent design, there are some who are young earthers, but most of the intelligent design field are not young earthers. Michael Behe accepts the true age of the earth and even common descent of all living things. But I've come full circle on that. I think that's correct. I think you said his name is Matt Young. I think that's correct. I think they're all versions of creationism. And some of them, like young earth, have a really poor scientific foundation. and some of them are further along, but they are all versions of creationism in the sense that they see that natural processes are insufficient to explain what we observe. And science really doesn't address that question in a sense. What we address is what we can observe. And what we found is there are no big gaps. There's no big holes in our understanding. There's lots of work to do. And we have to flesh out all of these events and these explanations. But anytime, and they have to be really careful, that the whole God of the gaps thing, where anytime we don't know something, they fill it in with the designer. I mean, you look really stupid 10 years from now when we fill that hole. So, you know, they keep sliding back and making God smaller and smaller and smaller. I mean, it's creationism.
Yeah, God of the Gaps, which is a little bit better than God of the Old Navy. Oh, you know what? I almost forgot to mention this. I was totally neglectful, and you didn't remind me. There was an exclusive article about you in skepticalinquirer.org.
Oh, right. I forgot about
They
that.
featured you. Yeah, exactly. So everybody, I recommend you check that out. And it's our Not So Intelligent Design exclusive feature interview with you in Skeptical Inquirer. Apparently, we love you over here.
It's mutual.
Yeah, and that was Rob Palmer, and I thank you for that reminder. And he has a question for you. He said, I often hear creationists will accept micro, but not accept macro evolution, because it would need billions of years, which they believe is science fiction. What? That's insane. So how do they account for the millions or tens of millions of species which must have evolved super fast, most extinct now, all from the few kinds saved on the ark? All is it, or is it just supposed to be a few thousand years?
Right. So, I mean, the microevolution, macroevolution divide, that's one thing that's common throughout the creationist movement. And like Michael Behe, he sees microevolution as possible by natural processes, but macroevolution is not. And young Earth creationists go with this as well. So they see small amounts of diversification that can happen quickly. And in fact, they actually give evolution more credit in some cases, because there's no way we could see the diversification in just, you know, what is it? The ark was 5,000 years ago or 4,000, whatever it is. So there's no way we could see diversification since then. So the line that they draw between micro and macro evolution is simply a matter of time scale. Right? We can observe things at shorter time scales. And yes, of course, it's hard to observe things that take 10 million years to happen, but we can model them, and that's what we do. So macroevolution is not outside the realm of science. We've been working on those problems for a while. And we also know that the pace of evolution is not the same. So there are some rapid evolutionary changes that have happened. I mean, I wrote articles about in 15 generations, there's a species of gecko in Florida that changed the shape of their feet in 15 generations in order to move higher up the trees because an invasive competitor came in. And there's lots of examples of this where evolution can work very rapidly under certain circumstances. And so the micro-macro line is arbitrary. But they exploit that as one's easier to see in the lab and one's, of course, more difficult. And we have to do it with fossils. And remember, only bones fossilize. Lots of other stuff doesn't fossilize. So we just don't know what existed before it. It's an arbitrary line. And like I said, they're just retreating to positions that they find defensible, meaning that it will be harder and harder to attack their positions because the evidence won't be there. But there's a word for that, unfalsifiable. That's generally makes it outside of science.
Thank you. Someone has asked, I love the ethics that are showing up here in the questions. People seem genuinely offended that Dr. Behe, is, as you said, not responding, replying, not responding, is putting false information out there. And L. Wise wanted to know, has Dr. Behe ever presented at a society meeting or debated anyone knowledgeable in evolution?
Certainly not at scholarly society meetings. No. He doesn't go to those kinds of conferences that I'm aware of anyway. That I'm aware of. He does apparently appear in public, and I know he appeared at a Veritas forum with Josh Swamidas actually somewhere in Texas A&M, I think it was. So he does speak, and he does present his work, not so much in debate format, but it's occasionally in conversation format. But he will almost always do it in front of friendly audiences. So the Veritas Forum is a Christian organization that does good work in trying to reconcile faith and science. for communities of faith at secular institutions. I think is part of their mission. I'm not sure. I've spoken at a Veritas forum, so they had me there. so I mean, they're open to the free exchange of ideas at Veritas. And Behe did an event around this book. So you can find, if you go on YouTube and find Behe, you will find presentations, but it's almost always in front of a friendly audience.
Yeah, as a stand-up comic, I can attest to the desire to have a friendly audience, for sure. Yeah, the hostile,
Fair
angry
enough.
ones with their arms folded. Yeah, nobody wants that. Nobody wants that.
Yeah, fair enough.
There are several folks in here who were kind enough to let me know that they did not have questions, but they just wanted to say thank you and yay science.
Yeah.
That's much appreciated that there are still fans. Let's see, and I'll wind up with this last couple. Claudette Polyakov, if I've done that correctly, given the example we have in viruses' ability to mutate with incredible speed, the statistical need for a designer weakens substantially. Not a question, sorry.
But it's true though, that's absolutely right. So we've learned a lot about mechanisms for evolution by studying things like viruses and also bacteria, but viruses just because they have the numbers, they have the speed, and they have the small compact genomes where you can study, what would take humans 1 billion years, a virus can do in a few years. They reproduce so rapidly in such great numbers that you can see how evolution works. And what we see, the grand total of all that work, is tinkering, right? You have unguided, tinkering around with all the DNA sequences. And then when you settle on something that works well, then that takes over and it takes over the population, and then more tinkering. And then that takes over in the population, more tinkering, then that takes over in the population. And by the way, the same thing happens in a solid tumor. So if someone who has cancer and they have a solid tumor, what you're seeing inside that tumor is an incredible amount of competition that goes on, and the cells all vying for space, and a ton of cell death along the way. And you have generations of new cancer cells. It's not the same cancer 6 months from now that it is today, because new mutations have emerged and then they take over the population and they outcrowd everything else. And so between tumors and viruses and other things like this, we've actually seen it happen in fast forward. And we notice that the tinkering is random, but the selection is strong. And so all the tinkering, and then a good combination appears and it takes over. And then more tinkering, a better combination appears. And remember, that better combination can be simplification. It doesn't necessarily mean more sophisticated. And that's my book, Human Errors, talks about that. Like, we are not the pinnacles of creation or evolution, right? We have lots of mistakes and inefficiencies. Leanne, present company excluded.
Well, thank you. My ego needed to hear that. I appreciate it.
But anyway, it's absolutely right. If you look at viruses and tumors, they recapitulate the evolutionary process really, really well.
Okay, I will say this is the final question, and there are some good ones in here, but I think this is a good place to wrap up. And this is from Byron Sacre. Where does the future of evolutionary science go next?
Well, I'm glad you said that, because evolutionary theory is still very much an active field, and we're definitely working out a lot of the particular mechanisms, especially in how genomes evolve. Because one thing we're realizing is that DNA codes for RNA, codes for protein, is just the simplistic way to look at our genomes. Our genomes are much more dynamic than that. They're moving around. Your DNA is not static. It's moving around constantly. You yourself have hundreds of mutations that you're adding to the gene pool. So that's one way, evolutionary theory is modeling it. A second way, and this I talk a lot about in the book, is evolutionary medicine. So the idea of understanding the world we were evolved to live in, and understanding the lives that we once lived, the bodies that as we were meant to use them, so to speak, can actually really help with human health and disease. You can live a better life if you sort of make peace with how our ancestors lived. And that doesn't mean we have to go back into hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but it means that there's some wisdom in that lifestyle that we can add on to our day. So get out of your chairs, get stand-up desks. That's one thing.
What? No, not the standing.
Get out of those chairs, eat less carbs. I mean, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from evolutionary medicine. So I think I think we're even understanding our pro-social instincts. So how to tweak our psychology so that we make a better society. I think that's a new frontier in evolutionary science. David Sloan Wilson and several others are working on problems like that. And how do we sort of engineer ourselves to be less selfish, for example, and more society minded. So I think it's as vibrant as ever.
I'm glad you said that because I want to say that I think that is definitely getting a push because of the way that we're living now, that people are staying home and we're losing some of that human connection, and we're
Mhm.
really looking at the upcoming mental health crisis. And it's like, okay, how do we really do better
Yeah,
as humans here?
we were not
Uh,
meant to live this way in a
no.
variety of reasons. Yeah.
No, not at all. Not at all. Netflix is great, but evolutionary, I don't know, maybe not. But Nathan, thank you so much for your
My pleasure.
time and your expertise. I really appreciate it, and I will remind everyone that's here that, again, this is recorded, and you can catch up and review when we release it tomorrow on the website. And I will say that the next talk in our series is coming up very quickly. Believe it or not, that is October 8th, everybody. We are moving into October. And I get to sit down and talk with Sasha Sagan, Rituals for Non-Believers, and her book. She'll be talking about this from her book, for creatures, small creatures such as we. My cat and I are enjoying this immensely. When I sit to read, he pops up in my lap as if he understands every word. But again, thank you, Nathan. Thank you to Skeptical Inquirer and my amazing tech team, which is Mark. Thank you for making us all look and sound good, and fixing the glitches. I appreciate it. My name is Leanne Lord, and thank you for joining us for Skeptical Inquirer Presents. Nathan, thank you. I'll see the rest of you back here October 8th for Sasha Sagan. Good night.